Close your eyes and remember the Britain of the 1970s. The smell of vinyl seats warming in rare summer sunshine. The distinctive rattle of a cold engine turning over on a February morning. The sound of indicator stalks clicking in rhythm with Radio 2. These were the cars that sat on every street, outside every factory gate, in every seaside car park from Margate to Morecambe. They carried us to work, to the coast, to relatives we visited once a year. They broke down, they rusted, they became part of the family. This is the story of 10 cars that defined a decade, machines so woven into the fabric of British life that even now, decades later, the sight of one can transport you back instantly. Before we begin our journey, do consider subscribing to keep these memories alive. The 1970s was a decade when car ownership ceased being aspirational and became ordinary. Families who'd never owned a vehicle suddenly had one parked outside their council house or semi-detached. British Leyland dominated, though its products were already showing signs of the decline that would devastate communities. Imports remained rare enough to turn heads. These weren't just machines. They were symbols of independence, modernity, and a working-class prosperity that felt permanent but wasn't. They mattered because they represented freedom. Number 10. The Hillman Avenger. The Hillman Avenger arrived in 1970 as Chrysler's answer to the Ford Escort, and for much of the decade it was everywhere. You'd see them outside factories in Coventry, parked at suburban stations, queuing at petrol pumps during the fuel crisis. Salesmen drove them. Driving instructors taught in them. They were respectable without being flash, affordable without being cheap. The Avenger represented safe aspiration, a car your father might buy after years of saving, something reliable to take the family to Butlins or ferry the shopping back from fine fare. They rusted catastrophically, bodies dissolving before engines gave up, and by the early 1980s most had returned to the earth. But for a time, they were the dependable face of Middle England motoring. Number 9. The Austin Allegro. Few cars have been so mocked yet so common as the Austin Allegro. Launched in 1973 to replace the much-loved 1100, it was meant to be modern, practical, revolutionary. Instead it became a symbol of everything wrong with British Leyland. The square steering wheel baffled drivers. The build quality was shameful even by the standards of the day. Yet millions were sold because British Leyland dealers dominated high streets, because hire purchase was easy, because your neighbor had one. You'd see Allegros outside schools, doctors' surgeries, bingo halls. They were transport, nothing more. Their very ordinariness made them invisible until they disappeared entirely, scrapped without ceremony, mourned by almost nobody except those who remember simpler times. Number 8. The Vauxhall Chevette. The Vauxhall Chevette arrived in 1975, a small hatchback built in Ellesmereport that somehow felt more modern than its British Leyland rivals. It was General Motors engineering adapted for British roads, and it worked. Young couples bought them as first cars. Pensioners downsized to them. They were cheap to run, easy to park, and crucially, they didn't fall apart quite as quickly as the competition. You'd see them in new town car parks, outside polytechnics, at supermarkets on Saturday mornings. The Chevette represented practical choice in an era when choice was limited. By the mid-1980s, Japanese imports had made them look old-fashioned, and they faded without fanfare, remembered now only by those who drove them daily. Number 7. The Triumph Dolomite. The Triumph Dolomite occupied unusual territory, slightly upmarket, vaguely sporting, aspirational without being unattainable. Launched in 1972, it appealed to junior managers, ambitious salesmen, families who wanted something better than an Escort. The Sprint version, with its 16-valve engine, offered genuine performance, though most Dolomites were humbler 1300s or 1500s, parked outside semis in Reading or Solihull. They had a certain style, a suggestion of class mobility. Owning one meant you'd done reasonably well without showing off. Build quality varied wildly. Some lasted years, others shed parts like autumn leaves. They disappeared as British Leyland collapsed, taking with them a particular kind of middle-class aspiration that never quite returned. Number 6. The Chrysler Alpine. The Chrysler Alpine, later renamed the Talbot Alpine after Peugeot's takeover, was Chrysler Europe's attempt at a modern family hatchback. Launched in 1975, it was assembled in Coventry, and for a few years it sold steadily, parked outside terraced houses and suburban drives across Britain. It was anonymous, practical, utterly forgettable except to those who owned one. Families used them for the weekly shop, for day trips to the countryside, for commuting through streets still relatively empty by today's standards. They rusted as enthusiastically as every other British car of the era. By the early 1980s, they'd vanished, victims of better competition and indifferent build quality, leaving barely a trace in automotive history. Number 5. The Morris Marina. The Morris Marina was British Leyland's best-selling car of the 1970s, which tells you everything about that troubled decade. Launched in 1971 as a cheap, simple rival to the Ford Cortina, it sold over 1 million units despite being outdated from birth. You couldn't avoid them. They were everywhere: company fleets, driving schools, rental agencies, private driveways. Police drove them, vicars drove them. They were transport at its most basic, neither inspiring nor reliable but affordable and available. The Marina represented compromise, making do, the British acceptance of second best. They rotted quickly, often abandoned after just 5 years. Now they're almost extinct, but for a decade they were the default choice of millions. Number 4. The Ford Cortina Mark III. The Ford Cortina Mark III, launched in 1970, was the people's car of 1970s Britain. It outsold everything, parked outside factories and offices, suburban semis, and new estates from Plymouth to Dundee. Ford got everything right: styling that looked modern, build quality better than British Leyland, financing that made ownership possible for ordinary families. The Cortina meant you'd arrived at respectability. Company representatives drove them endless motorway miles. Families packed them for holidays in Devon or Wales. They were classless in a class-obsessed society, equally at home outside a Bradford mill or a Berkshire villa. By decade's end, rust claimed most of them, but their dominance defined an era when Ford meant Britain and Britain meant Ford. Number 3. The Vauxhall Viva. The Vauxhall Viva, particularly the HC model from 1970 onwards, was the small car for families who couldn't afford or didn't need a Cortina. Millions were built at Ellesmere Port, shipped to dealers across Britain, sold to young couples, pensioners, anyone wanting basic, affordable transport. They were utterly conventional, for doors, simple mechanics, styling that aged quickly. You'd see them everywhere, parked at factories, shops, railway stations. They represented modest ambition, the bottom rung of car ownership. Vauxhall's engineering was solid enough, but British rust claimed most within a decade. The Viva disappeared without sentiment, superseded by the Chevette, forgotten except as a faint memory of cheaper, simpler times. Number 2. The Austin Maxi. The Austin Maxi arrived in 1969 but dominated much of the 1970s as British Leyland's family hatchback. It was clever, spacious, practical, with a 5-speed gearbox unusual for the time. It should have succeeded brilliantly. Instead, it became another symbol of squandered potential. The cable gear change was notoriously difficult. Build quality was appalling. They rusted catastrophically, yet families bought them because British Leyland dealers were everywhere, because finance was easy, because the space was genuinely useful. You'd see Maxis outside comprehensives, health centers, municipal car parks. They carried shopping, children, camping equipment. They represented good ideas executed badly, potential unfulfilled. By the 1980s, most had dissolved, leaving barely a trace. Number 1. The Ford Escort Mark II. The Ford Escort Mark II, launched in 1975, became the definitive British car of the late 1970s. It was everywhere, utterly dominant, the default choice for millions. Ford had perfected the formula: modern styling, reliable mechanics, excellent dealer network, competitive pricing. Young drivers passed their tests in them. Families chose them over anything British Leyland offered. Police patrolled in them. They were classless, reliable, unremarkable in the best possible way. The Escort represented what British Leyland could have been but wasn't: competent, consistent, trustworthy. Rally versions won championships while ordinary ones ferried ordinary people through ordinary lives. They rusted eventually, but slowly. The Escort Mark II was Britain on wheels. These cars carried us through a difficult, defining decade. They took us to work through 3-day weeks, to beaches during rare heatwaves, to relatives at Christmas. They broke down, they rusted, they frustrated us, but they kept Britain moving when little else seemed certain. Most are gone now, crushed or dissolved, but the memories remain vivid: vinyl seats, the smell of petrol and oil, windscreens that iced inside and out. They were part of the fabric of life, as ordinary as bread and as essential. If these memories resonate, do leave a comment below and subscribe to Britain Rewind for more journeys into Britain's past.